showing off.
Maybe a little.
Welcome to Davey Dave's Take. Today we are talking about Madam Web, the latest comic book film from Marvel. Cassandra Webb develops the power to see the future, forced to confront revelations about her past. She forges a relationship with three young women bound for powerful destinies. There's been a lot of buzz around this film ever since they announced it, the cast, the production, everything, and then that first trailer dropped and there's even more buzz. But not in the film's favor. But sometimes trailers do injustice to the film. You see the film, you're like, alright, that was pretty good. But with Madam Web, I think the trailer's pretty spot on. But I gotta give credit to the marketing team. At least they're being honest. Yeah, I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. This film was an absolute disaster. And hopefully this is a wake-up call to Sony to stop making shitty-ass origin movies about characters no one gives a shit about. But they're probably not gonna learn their lesson because they literally got trolled into re-releasing Morbius like 2 years ago. But seriously, why does Sony keep making films like this to set up this universe with Morbius and Madam Web and Kraven the Hunter? But they're probably not gonna learn their lesson. But that's not even the biggest issue with Madam Web. The biggest problem with Madam Web, it feels like every aspect of filmmaking here, they're just doing the bare minimum. When it comes to directing, editing, screenwriting, some of the performances, the special effects, it feels like everyone's putting in no effort at all. Especially the script. I mean, there are parts throughout the film where I was like, that has to be from the first draft, right? Like, the dialogue here is so bad it's laughable. There's a part where they had no shame towards the end of the film where they wanted to say a line, but they didn't want to just copy and paste it from a famous comic book movie, from a famous comic book. So they tried to just move the words around and kind of butcher it and think nobody would notice. I'm like, wow, they're not even trying at this point. If this was like an essay and you turn that into a high school teacher or college professor, they would kick you out of the class for plagiarism. And like I said, it's all aspects of filmmaking. So when you combine those two together, I would say the last 2/3 of this movie feel like absolute schlock. But I gotta say, parts of it is schlock in that fun way where you're watching a movie and be like, oh my god, this is so bad that this is so fun. But there are parts throughout this film where it absolutely drags because there's really not much going on. It's mostly about Cassandra Webb trying to figure out what the fuck's going on, but it's really not that interesting. And the way this film is marketed with the posters and the trailers and everything like that, if you think you're gonna get a bunch of action scenes with Spider-Women and all that, you're gonna be really disappointed. Which for me wasn't a big issue because I felt like this film was gonna be all about Madam Web because that is literally in the title. My problem is, it just wasn't interesting. Speaking of characters, let's talk about performances. And I don't like to criticize them because it's a lot harder than it looks. But I have to say something here. I'm not saying every performance in this movie is bad. There's a couple I thought were really fun. But I gotta say, it feels like everyone's just going through the motions. Like everyone just wants to go home and take a nap. And there are two performances that feel like that. And the first one I want to talk about is Dakota Johnson. Look, I know at this point, she's kind of made it clear she did not like the production of this movie. She even said something where it's like, how the hell do people work like this when you're working behind a green screen and people are screaming like, explosion over there? She's like, how the fuck do people act like this? But I have to say here, it seems like she's putting no effort here. It really feels like she's just annoyed to be there. So I gotta say, that's obviously a huge problem when it feels like your main character doesn't even want to be there, then why would you want to be there? And the second performance is the villain. And I don't even know if it's his fault because some of his lines of dialogue are just so bad. I don't think anyone could make that work. But there are just so many parts of his performance that just feels so stale and monotoned and boring and hollow that this is one of the worst comic book villains I think I've ever seen. And that reminds me specifically with his character, there are some sound editing and dubbing here that are the worst I've ever seen in a big budget movie. There are many parts throughout the film where his character or even some other characters are speaking full lines of dialogue and their mouths are completely shut. Their mouths might open 1 or 2 times, but they'll be like, we have to get to the Amazon to find these spiders. And this happens so many times throughout the film, so it's insane that Sony thought no one would notice. There's some horrible special effects, but I have to preference, I don't think it's the artist's fault. They probably had some unrealistic deadline that they couldn't hit, so it's not their fault. I have to imagine that it's probably the studio's fault. It's normally the studio's fault. Look, I'm completely shitting on this film, and I have to preference, this isn't the worst thing I've ever seen in the world. There are parts throughout the first act that seem like this film might have had some promise with the gimmick with Dakota Johnson seeing the future. There's some sequences that look like they could have been a lot of fun. Unfortunately, they just don't do too much with them, and sometimes you just feel really repetitive. Like with some of the setup here, there could have been something interesting here, but they just picked all the wrong decisions. Since almost everything in this film doesn't work, a lot of it does feel like schlock, especially in the final act, so you might be able to have fun with that. But like I said before, this film just has no shame with trying to set up some bigger universe here with how it ends and some of the lines of dialogue. It fails on that front. And when it comes to an origin story, it does the absolute bare minimum, so it fails there. But that's how the film feels. It just feels like they're doing the bare minimum, and that's why it completely fails. I'm gonna give Madam Web 2.5 Davey Daves. Sony might wake the fuck up and be like, hey, we should maybe invest our time and money into something that's way more creative, something that's way more thought out, and maybe people will go see that, because these origin stories are just not doing it for anyone. But then again, they just made Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, and that's one of the greatest comic book movies ever made. But is that really Sony, or is that more Phil Lord and Chris Miller? So, Madam Web, let me know what you guys thought of it once you've seen it. I'm curious to hear. And thank you so much for watching. Click here to see more of Dave's Takes.